Before the internet, before the printing press, before democracy, philosophy, the alphabet, or the wheel, before almost everything we call civilization, there was wine. And wine didn't just exist alongside civilization, wine built it. The oldest winery ever discovered is 6,000 years old. It predates the Egyptian pyramids by 1,000 years. The oldest written recipe in human history, wine. The drink that sealed the first trade agreements, the one poured at the feet of gods, the one that funded the Roman legions, the one the Catholic Church carried across an entire planet. Wine is not a drink. Wine is the thread that runs through all of human history. And the grape, that small, ordinary fruit growing on a vine in your neighbor's garden, is possibly the most consequential plant ever cultivated by human hands. But here is the question no one asks. Why wine? Why grapes? Why this fruit of all the fruits in the world? By the end of this you will know. And the answer will change the way you see every glass you ever hold. Think about this for a moment. A grape is one of the most finicky, demanding, temperamental plants on Earth. It takes 3 to 5 years before a newly planted vine produces its first fruit. It needs specific soil, specific climate, specific slope, elevation, drainage, sun exposure. It is devastated by frost, drowned by too much rain, scorched by too much heat. And yet, despite all of this, ancient humans looked at this plant and decided it was worth the effort. Not just worth it, worth centuries of cultivation, worth trade networks spanning thousands of miles, worth wars, worth the construction of entire systems of law to protect it. Why? Part of the answer is obvious: alcohol. The fermented grape produces ethanol, and ethanol makes humans feel extraordinary. It lowers anxiety. It eases pain. It creates the feeling of warmth and connection. In the cold, brutal uncertainty of the ancient world, a substance that could do that was more valuable than gold. But that is only part of the story. Beer was easier to make. Mead, fermented honey, was simpler. Both existed before wine. Both produced alcohol. So why did wine win? Wine did something beer and mead could not do. Wine aged. Wine improved over time. Wine could be stored for years, even decades, and become more complex, more valuable, more extraordinary. That meant wine could be stockpiled, traded, used as currency, given as tribute, shipped across oceans. Wine was not just a drink, it was a form of preserved wealth, a commodity that stored value the way gold did, but also sustained life. And there was something else, something that the ancient world understood instinctively, even before anyone had the vocabulary to explain it. The grape is the only fruit that contains everything it needs to ferment itself. Wild yeasts live on the skin of every grape. When the skin is broken, those yeasts begin consuming the sugar inside. The grape ferments naturally without any human intervention. Primitive humans did not invent wine, they discovered it. A pile of crushed grapes left in the rain became something intoxicating, complex, and transformative. They did not know why, they only knew it happened. And when they went looking for the reason, searching for the divine explanation for this miraculous transformation of fruit into spirit, they built entire religions around the answer. That is where our story truly begins. The year is approximately 6,000 BCE. We are in the South Caucasus region, the mountains and valleys that today make up the countries of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The climate here is a sweet spot: warm summers, cool winters, rocky, well-drained soil. Wild Vitis vinifera, the ancestor of every wine grape on earth, grows along riverbanks and up into the forest clearings. The people here were early agriculturalists. They grew grain, they kept livestock, they were smart, pragmatic, and deeply observant of the natural world. And at some point, probably by accident, almost certainly repeated many times before anyone thought to preserve it, they discovered fermentation. In 2017, archaeologists at a site called Gadakrili Gora in Georgia discovered ceramic jars dating to 6,000 BCE. Inside those jars, preserved for 8,000 years, was chemical residue. Tartaric acid, malic acid, citric acid, succinic acid. The chemical fingerprint of wine. 8,000 years old, the oldest evidence of winemaking in human history. And this was not primitive accidental fermentation. These jars showed deliberate cultivation, deliberate collection, deliberate storage. The people who made this wine understood what they were doing. They had developed a process, a craft, a technology. The wine revolution had begun. It is no coincidence that the region where wine was born is also the region described in the book of Genesis as the landing place of Noah's Ark. The story is well known. The flood recedes. The ark rests on Mount Ararat in modern-day eastern Turkey on the border with Armenia. Noah emerges, and the very first thing he does, he plants a vineyard. And then he drinks the wine and gets drunk, and the story gets complicated. But what matters is this: in the oldest written tradition of Western civilization, the grape is the first cultivated crop of the post-flood world. The first act of civilization is wine-making. This is not an accident of storytelling. This reflects a deep cultural memory, an understanding encoded in mythology that wine and civilization were born together, that they are inseparable. The ancient Armenians and Georgians who lived in the shadow of Ararat had been making wine for millennia before anyone wrote it down. They had carried that knowledge in their hands and their traditions. And when the story of civilization's first farmer was written, it was a winemaker they imagined. By 3000 BCE, wine had made it south, into the flat river valleys of Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, where the Sumerians had built the world's first cities. And the Sumerians did something remarkable. They wrote everything down. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest literary works in human history, features wine prominently. Enkidu, the wild man who becomes Gilgamesh's companion, is civilized in part through wine. He drinks it and becomes human, becomes social, becomes capable of connection. This is not a small detail. It is a statement about what wine meant to the ancient world. Wine was not just a beverage, it was the substance that separated the civilized from the uncivilized, the symbol of sophistication, connection, and human complexity. The Sumerians also wrote the first recorded wine trade records, specific quantities, specific prices, specific destinations. Wine was being bought and sold, being transported, being taxed. And wherever wine went, civilization followed. By 3000 BCE, wine had also traveled west, into Egypt. And in Egypt, wine took on a dimension that would define its relationship with humanity for the next 5,000 years. Wine became sacred. Egyptians planted vineyards in the Nile Delta. They painted the grape harvest on tomb walls, every step of the process, from picking to pressing to storage, depicted in vivid color that has survived 4,000 years. Pharaohs were buried with wine jars marked with the vintage year, the vineyard name, and the quality assessment, the world's first wine labels. Wine was placed in tombs so the dead could drink it in the afterlife. It was offered to gods, poured on altars, used in healing rituals by priests who understood that its antiseptic properties could treat wounds. And here is something extraordinary. In the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun, discovered in 1922, archaeologists found 26 wine jars. Each was labeled not just with a year and vineyard, but with what we would today call a quality rating. Phrases like "very good wine" or "wine for merrymaking." The world's oldest wine reviews, written 3,300 years ago in a pharaoh's tomb. The Egyptians were not just consuming wine, they were connoisseurs. They cared about where the wine came from and how it was made, 1,000 years before the Greeks had a word for it. If Egypt made wine sacred, the Phoenicians made it global. The Phoenicians were the greatest maritime traders of the ancient world. Based in what is now Lebanon, they built a network of trading posts that stretched from the eastern Mediterranean to the Atlantic coast of Spain and North Africa. And wherever they went, they brought three things: their alphabet, their purple dye, and their wine. The Phoenicians planted vineyards at every outpost. They introduced grape cultivation to Spain, to North Africa, to Sicily and Sardinia. They taught local populations how to grow vines, how to ferment, how to store. They were not just selling wine, they were spreading the knowledge of how to make it. By 800 BCE, wine was being produced across the entire Mediterranean world. The grapevine had traveled from its birthplace in the Caucasus all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. A journey of 4,000 miles, spread not by conquest but by trade. And then the Greeks got involved, and everything changed again. To understand Greece's relationship with wine, you have to understand one word. Symposium. The word literally means drinking together. The symposium was the defining social institution of ancient Greek intellectual life, a gathering of men, philosophers, politicians, poets, artists who would recline on couches, drink wine, and argue. Not argue in the modern sense of shouting over each other, argue in the classical sense, form propositions, challenge assumptions, defend positions, seek truth. Plato's greatest philosophical dialogues were set at symposia, the Republic. The symposium itself, which is literally an exploration of the nature of love, conducted over cups of wine. Socrates drank at symposia, Aristotle argued at them, Aristophanes performed comedies that mocked them. Wine was the lubricant of Greek intellectual life, not because it made people smarter, though the Greeks believed it genuinely clarified thinking in moderate amounts, but because it created the psychological safety to speak freely. There is a phrase attributed to the Greeks, oinos kai aletheia, wine and truth, the idea that wine strips away the social masks we wear and allows the real self to speak. In vino veritas, in wine, truth, the Romans said it, the Greeks believed it. The entire Western tradition of intellectual discourse was born at tables where wine was flowing. But the Greeks were not simply drinkers, they were obsessed with the ethics of drinking. The symposium had strict rules. Wine was always diluted with water, the ratio carefully managed by a symposiarch, a kind of master of ceremonies who controlled how much was drunk. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric, the mark of an uncivilized person. The goal was not intoxication. The goal was a specific altered state, relaxed, open, creative, but still rational, still capable of philosophy. This distinction between wine as civilizing force and wine as destructive excess runs through all of Greek culture. It is embodied in the god they built around it. Dionysus. God of wine, god of ecstasy, god of theater, god of the irrational. God of the terrifying, beautiful, transformative power of losing yourself. Dionysus is one of the strangest and most fascinating figures in ancient mythology. He is simultaneously the god of joy and the god of madness, the god of liberation and the god of destruction. In the myths, Dionysus inspires his female worshippers, the Maenads, to ecstatic, frenzied states. They dance wildly in the mountains. They are said to tear animals apart with their bare hands. But Dionysus is also the patron of theater, of art, of storytelling. Every play performed in ancient Athens, from the tragedies of Sophocles to the comedies of Aristophanes, was performed at a festival in Dionysus's honor. What does it mean that the Greeks built their greatest artistic tradition around the god of wine? It means they understood something profound, that creativity requires the dissolution of the ego, that the highest forms of human expression, tragedy, comedy, poetry, music, come from the same place as intoxication, from surrendering control, from allowing something larger than the individual self to move through you. Wine was not just a social lubricant, it was a tool of transcendence. And the Greeks encoded that understanding in a god. When Rome rose to power, it inherited everything from Greece. The philosophy, the architecture, the gods renamed, slightly rearranged. Dionysus became Bacchus. The symposium became the convivium. And wine became something even bigger than it had been before. Wine became the blood of empire. The Roman legions ran on wine. Every soldier received a daily ration, roughly a liter of wine per day, usually mixed with water. This was not indulgence, it was necessity. The wine was slightly acidic, slightly alcoholic. In a world without water treatment, where rivers and streams carried disease, where typhoid and dysentery were constant killers, wine diluted in water was safe to drink. It killed bacteria that would have killed the soldier. The Roman army expanded across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. And wherever the legions went, they needed wine. That meant supply lines. That meant vineyards near the frontier. That meant teaching conquered populations to grow grapes. The Roman military did not just conquer Gaul, Spain, and Britain. It planted vineyards there. The great wine regions of France, Bordeaux, Burgundy, the Rhone Valley were established by Roman soldiers and settlers. The German wine regions along the Rhine and Moselle, Roman camps and colonies. The vineyards of Spain, of Portugal, of England, all Roman. When historians talk about Romanization, the process by which conquered peoples adopted Roman culture, they often talk about language, law, and architecture. They should talk more about wine. Because the grapevine was one of the most powerful instruments of cultural transformation the Romans possessed. A conquered Gaul who learned to grow grapes learned to think like a Roman, learned to plan long-term because vines take years, learned to manage land systematically, learned to participate in trade networks that stretched to Rome itself. The grape was a civilizing tool, a technology of empire. At the height of the Roman Empire, wine was being traded on a scale that is almost incomprehensible. The Mediterranean was crisscrossed with ships carrying amphorae, large ceramic storage vessels filled with wine from every province. Italian wine, Spanish wine, Greek wine, North African wine. Archaeologists have found Roman shipwrecks in the Mediterranean carrying up to 10,000 amphorae. Each amphora held roughly 25 liters. A single ship could carry 250,000 liters of wine. The Romans were so obsessed with wine quality that they developed the first systematic approach to what we now call terroir, the idea that where a wine is grown determines its character. The wine critic Pliny the Elder wrote extensively about the great vineyards of Italy. He ranked them. He described the soils, the slopes, the microclimates. He warned against vintages that had been adulterated. 2,000 years before Wine Spectator, Romans were arguing about wine ratings. And then Rome fell. And the question became, who would keep the vine alive? In 476 CE, the Western Roman Empire collapsed. The administrative systems that had managed trade across a continent dissolved. The roads fell into disrepair, the merchant networks fragmented, the cities emptied. The elaborate wine market that had connected Spain to Egypt, that had moved hundreds of millions of liters of wine across the Mediterranean world, it was gone. This was catastrophic for wine culture. The great commercial vineyards that Rome had established across Europe were abandoned. Without the infrastructure of empire to move wine to market, there was no point in producing it at scale. Many of the grape varieties that Rome had cultivated, hundreds of distinct cultivars, the product of centuries of selection and care, were lost. The accumulated knowledge of Roman viticulture, the understanding of which grapes grew where, which soils produced what flavors, which techniques yielded the best results, much of it was lost with the civilization that had created it. But not all of it. Because of one institution that outlasted Rome by more than 1,000 years. The Catholic Church. Here is a fact that sounds almost too neat to be true, but is absolutely real. The Catholic Church needed wine to survive, not metaphorically, literally. The Eucharist, the central sacrament of Christianity, the ritual that defines what it means to be Catholic, requires wine. The bread and wine that become the body and blood of Christ, that is not optional. That is doctrine. That is the heart of the faith. Every church in Christendom needed wine. Every Mass celebrated anywhere in the world required it. And by the year 500 CE, Christianity had spread across what had been the Roman Empire, from Ireland to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. The demand for wine was enormous, constant, non-negotiable. And so the church grew grapes. The monasteries of medieval Europe became the great centers of wine knowledge. Benedictine monks, Cistercian monks, Carthusian monks, they cultivated vineyards with a care and dedication that was explicitly theological. Tending the vine was not just farming, it was prayer, it was devotion, it was service to God. And because monasteries were stable institutions, protected by the church, endowed with land, exempt from many of the taxes and tributes that plagued secular life, they could take the long view. They could experiment over decades. They could plant new varieties, observe how they grew, select the best plants, and gradually refine their vineyards over generations. The monks of Burgundy, particularly the Cistercian monks of the Abbey of Cîteaux, spent centuries mapping their vineyards, testing every plot, tasting every batch. identifying which specific parcels of land produced wine of extraordinary quality. They called these parcels clos, enclosed vineyards, sacred spaces where the soil and the vine produced something almost miraculous. The most famous of these, the Clos de Vougeot, was established in the 12th century. The Cistercians tended it for 600 years. The concept of terroir, the idea that place determines quality, was not a modern innovation. It was a medieval theological concept. The monks believed that God had embedded perfection in specific parcels of earth and that their job was to find it and express it. The rise of Islam in the 7th century CE created one of the great paradoxes of wine history. Islam prohibited the drinking of alcohol. The Quran explicitly forbade intoxicants. In theory, this should have destroyed wine culture in every region Islam reached. And indeed, in many parts of the former Roman and Byzantine worlds, Egypt, North Africa, the Middle East, wine production declined dramatically. But here's the paradox. Islamic civilization produced some of the greatest wine poetry ever written. The Persian poet Omar Khayyam, whose Rubaiyat was translated into English in the 19th century and became one of the most beloved poems in the English language, is almost entirely about wine, about the cup, about the tavern, about the beauty of transience and pleasure. The Sufi mystics used wine as a metaphor for divine love. The wine was the love of God, the tavern was the soul, the intoxication was the ecstasy of union with the divine. And Islamic scholars, who preserved and translated the works of Greek and Roman writers during the European Dark Ages, preserved the wine knowledge of Pliny and Dioscorides and Columella. They kept the intellectual tradition alive even as they abstained from the practice. Wine in the Islamic world became an idea, a metaphor, a philosophy, which perhaps says something profound about what wine has always meant to humanity, not just a drink, a symbol, a lens through which to examine the deepest questions of what it means to be alive. The year is 1863, southern France. A winemaker notices something wrong with his vines. The leaves are yellowing, the shoots are stunted, the grapes are small and shriveled. He pulls a vine from the ground and examines the roots. They are rotted, black, covered in tiny, barely visible insects. He does not know it yet. But he is looking at the beginning of the greatest agricultural catastrophe in European history. Phylloxera vastatrix, a tiny aphid-like insect so small it is almost invisible to the naked eye, that feeds on the roots of the European grapevine. It had arrived from North America, almost certainly carried on botanical samples imported by curious horticulturalists who wanted to study American grape varieties. In North America, native grapevines had evolved alongside phylloxera for millions of years. They had developed resistance. Their roots were tough enough to survive the insects feeding. European vines had never encountered phylloxera. They had no defense, none. The insect feeds on the root swells and rots, the vine is cut off from water and nutrients, and then it dies. Over the next 30 years, phylloxera killed 40% of all the vineyards in France. 6 million acres of vines destroyed by an insect smaller than a sesame seed. Wine regions that had been continuously cultivated since Roman times, vineyards that had survived the fall of empires, the Black Death, the 100 Years' War. Gone. The French wine industry, the most sophisticated, most revered, most economically significant wine culture in the world, was on the verge of collapse. Tens of thousands of wine-making families were ruined. The cultural fabric of wine-producing regions tore apart. The French government offered a prize of 300,000 francs, a vast sum, to anyone who could find a solution. The solution, when it came, was brilliant and deeply ironic. The cure for the American pest was American roots. A group of scientists, primarily working in France but in collaboration with American botanists, realized that while phylloxera could destroy European vine roots, it could not destroy American vine roots. The solution, grafting, taking the vine, the European Vitis vinifera vine that produced all the great wine grapes, and grafting it onto American rootstock. The American roots would survive in the soil. The phylloxera would feed on them and fail to kill them. and the European vine grafted on top would grow normally, producing its European fruit. Today, more than 99% of all wine vineyards in the world use grafted vines. The Chardonnay in your glass, the Cabernet Sauvignon, the Pinot Noir, the Riesling. They are all growing on American roots. The great wines of Bordeaux, of Burgundy, of Champagne, of Tuscany, all grafted. European wine culture survived the greatest threat it had ever faced by quietly becoming, in its foundations, American. The Old World was saved by the New World. The affliction and the cure came from the same place. But here is the haunting part of the phylloxera story. Many wine scholars and historians believe that the wines of the pre-phylloxera era, the wines produced by ungrafted vines growing in their native soil, were simply better. Different, at least possibly more complex, possibly with a character that modern wines grown on alien roots cannot fully replicate. There are a handful of places in the world where ungrafted vines still exist. Chile, isolated by the Andes and the Pacific, was never reached by phylloxera. Parts of Australia, the island of Santorini in Greece, where the volcanic sandy soil makes it impossible for phylloxera to survive. Winemakers who produce wine from these ungrafted old vines speak about them with reverence, a depth, a complexity, something that is difficult to articulate. We may never know exactly what was lost in those 30 years of devastation. The pre-phylloxera wines exist only in old tasting notes, in letters, in memories recorded by people who are long dead. One of the greatest chapters of wine history ended before anyone thought to preserve it properly. Another reminder that history does not always announce its endings. Today, the global wine industry is worth over $350 billion. Over 7 billion liters of wine are produced every year. Grapes are grown on every inhabited continent, in every major climate zone except the equatorial tropics. The traditional wine world, France, Italy, Spain, Germany, produces the most prestigious bottles, the wines that sell for thousands of dollars at auction, the wines that collectors age for decades. But the modern world has added new voices. California's Napa Valley, the Barossa Valley in Australia, Marlborough in New Zealand, the winelands of South Africa, Mendoza in Argentina, the Maipo Valley in Chile. These regions did not exist as wine producers 200 years ago. Today, they produce wines that compete with and sometimes surpass the finest European bottles. The 1976 Judgment of Paris changed everything. In 1976, a British wine merchant named Stephen Spurrier organized a blind tasting in Paris. French wines against California wines, judged by French experts, the most respected palates in the world. The result was humiliating for France. A California Chardonnay from Chateau Montelena took first place in the whites. A California Cabernet from Stag's Leap wine cellars won the reds. The French judges were so shocked that some tried to take their scorecards back. But the result stood. The new world had arrived. The wine world had been democratized. The modern wine industry has access to tools that would have seemed like magic to a medieval monk. Stainless steel fermentation tanks, temperature-controlled environments, centrifuges that can clarify wine instantly, reverse osmosis that can adjust alcohol levels, computer analysis of every chemical compound in a bottle. Modern winemakers can produce consistent, technically flawless wine in ways that were impossible even 50 years ago. This is incredible, and it is also slightly troubling. Because the pursuit of technical perfection has, in some cases, produced wines that are technically perfect and spiritually empty. Wines that score 95 points on a rating scale but taste like every other wine that scored 95 points. The machine has optimized the product, and in optimizing it, sometimes removed the thing that made it interesting. The tension in modern wine is the same tension in modern life, between the efficiency of standardization and the beauty of individual character. The best winemakers today are those who use technology as a servant rather than a master, who understand what science can do and choose when not to do it. The grapevine is one of the most climate-sensitive plants on Earth. Varieties that have been perfectly suited to their regions for centuries are now, as global temperatures rise, growing in places that are becoming too warm for them. Burgundy, the spiritual home of Pinot Noir, a grape that requires a cool climate to develop its characteristic elegance, is warming at a rate that alarms winemakers. Harvests that once took place in October now happen in August. The grapes are ripening too quickly. The complexity that comes from a long, slow-growing season is being squeezed out by heat. The regions of Spain and southern France that have grown robust, warm-climate varieties for centuries are now experiencing summers hot enough to scorch and shrivel the fruit on the vine. And as the traditional regions warm, new regions are opening up. English sparkling wine, which would have been considered a joke a generation ago, is now winning international competitions. Southern England's chalk soils are almost identical to those of Champagne. The warming climate has made it possible to ripen champagne grapes there. Vineyards are appearing in Scandinavia, in parts of Canada that were never warm enough. The grapevine is moving north, just as it moved west and south across Europe with the Romans, just as it moved across the Atlantic with the colonizers. The map of wine is being redrawn in real time. In ancient Rome, the finest wines sold for prices that would represent thousands of euros today. The best Falernian wine, the Petrus or Romani Conti of the Roman world, was available only to the very wealthy. An ordinary soldier might drink cheap wine. A senator drank something extraordinary. Today the spread is enormous. You can buy a perfectly drinkable bottle of wine for $5. For $10, you can find something genuinely good. But the rarest bottles have become more expensive than almost anything else on earth. In 2018, a single bottle of 1945 Romani Conti sold at auction for $558,000. One bottle, one glass of fermented grape juice. More than a median American household earns in a decade. What does this mean? It means that wine occupies a unique position in the modern world. It is simultaneously one of the most accessible pleasures available to almost anyone, and one of the last luxury goods that genuinely stratifies by wealth in ways that are almost feudal. The Roman senator and the Roman soldier drank different wine. The relationship between wealth and wine has barely changed in 2,000 years. A grapevine planted today will not produce its best fruit for 10, 15, 20 years. The greatest wines in the world come from vines that are 30, 40, 100 years old. Vines with roots that have pushed down through 20 feet of rock and clay, vines that have suffered, that have had to struggle. The stress produces complexity, the struggle produces depth. This is not metaphor, this is viticulture. Winemakers deliberately stress their vines, limiting water, limiting nutrients, to force the roots deeper and concentrate the flavors in the fruit. But it is also metaphor. The things in life that develop slowly, that require patience, that undergo difficulty, they tend to have more complexity, more depth, more nuance than things that come easily and quickly. The vine teaches patience. It rewards people who can think in decades. There are over 10,000 varieties of wine grape in the world. Most people have tasted maybe 5. Cabernet, Merlot, Chardonnay, Pinot Grigio, Sauvignon Blanc. These are the most commercially successful varieties. They dominate the market because they are reliable, consistent, and widely understood. But they represent less than 1% of the genetic diversity of the wine grape. The other 9,990 plus varieties include flavors and experiences that most people will never encounter. Wines that taste of smoked meat and mineral springs. Wines that taste of white flowers and volcanic rock. Wines that have no equivalent reference point in any familiar experience. The homogenization of wine, the dominance of a small number of international varieties, has made wine more accessible and less interesting. The same is true of culture, of ideas, of anything that benefits from diversity. Standardization brings reliability. It also brings monotony. There is a famous study in which neuroscientists gave wine drinkers the same wine in 2 different bottles, one labeled cheap, one labeled expensive, and scanned their brains. When people believed they were drinking expensive wine, the pleasure centers of their brains showed dramatically more activity. The wine was identical, the experience was completely different. This tells us something important, not about wine but about perception. We do not experience things objectively, we experience them through the story we tell ourselves about them. The context changes the content, which means the ancient practice of drinking wine in a setting of beauty among people you love with music and good conversation is not just tradition, it is neuroscience. The setting is part of the flavor, the company is part of the taste. Wine understood this before science did. France, Italy, and Spain together produce roughly half of all the wine in the world. The oldest known bottle of wine, still with liquid inside, dates to around 325 CE and was found in a Roman tomb near the German city of Speyer. It sits in a museum in Pfalz. No one has opened it. Riesling grapes can be harvested in December or even January, frozen on the vine, to produce Eiswein or ice wine. The frozen water crystals are separated from the concentrated juice, producing one of the sweetest, most complex wines in the world. The entire lineage of Cabernet Sauvignon, the most planted wine grape in the world, traces back to a single cross between Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc that occurred spontaneously, probably in 17th century France. One accidental pollination created a variety now grown on every continent. The word toast, as in raising a glass, comes from the Roman practice of placing a piece of toasted bread in a cup of wine. The bread absorbed the wine's impurities and improved the flavor. We still say toast even though the bread is gone. We began with a question. Why wine? Why grapes? Why this fruit of all the fruits in the world? And now you have the shape of an answer. The grape was chosen because it is the only fruit that transforms itself. That takes the raw sugar of sunshine and, through the mysterious alchemy of fermentation, becomes something greater than it started as. Ancient humans recognized this as magic, as divine, as a gift. And they built civilizations around the attempt to understand and replicate that transformation. Every great wine culture in history, Sumerian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, medieval, Christian, modern, French, has understood something that we sometimes forget in the age of craft cocktails and energy drinks. Wine is slow. Wine is patient. Wine is the product of a year's worth of sun and rain and labor, bottled and asked to wait, to become something richer than it was when it was sealed away. We live in an age of immediate everything, instant gratification, same-day delivery, streaming on demand, the 30-second attention span. And then there is wine telling you to wait, telling you that some things only get better with time. That depth requires patience. That complexity is the reward for endurance. The monks of Burgundy who spent 800 years mapping their vineyards did not live to see the wines their work would eventually produce. They worked for a future they would never inhabit, for people they would never meet, for a quality that would take generations to achieve. When is the last time you did something that was designed to be finished by someone else? When is the last time you planted a vine? The grape does not know it is making history. It is simply doing what grapes do, taking in the light, drawing up the water, storing the sugar, waiting for the moment of transformation. We are not so different. We take in our experiences, we store what nourishes us, we wait. And if we are patient enough, if we trust the process that billions of human beings before us trusted enough to build entire civilizations around, we become something richer than we were when we started. That is what the grape has always known. Maybe it is time we learned it too.